The storm outside rattled the palace walls, but even thunder couldn't silence the cries echoing from behind the emperor's private chamber. Senator Marcus Claudius stood frozen in the marble hallway, clutching a torch that shook in his trembling grip. Its flame threw jagged shadows across the stone, forcing him to light the very scene that was destroying his soul. 2 Praetorian guards flanked him, their faces as lifeless as carved statues, their hands resting casually on sword hilts. "Keep it steady, Senator," one murmured without emotion. "The Emperor demands proper light." Behind the heavy doors, Marcus's 14-year-old daughter, the same child who once played with dolls beneath his desk, was being reduced to an entry in an Imperial ledger. A clerk in a nearby alcove scratched away with his quill, recording every detail as though tallying grain shipments. Lightning lit the hall, revealing other fathers standing in line, each carrying their own torches, each wearing the same hollow expression. Their daughters were not children anymore. They were numbers. Inventory. Property of the Emperor. This was not chaos or random cruelty. This was a system. A machine of destruction disguised in silk and gold. It was documented, scheduled, catalogued with chilling precision. Evil had been transformed into procedure. How had Rome, proud Rome, descended into this abyss? How had fathers become unwilling accomplices, their daughters turned into state property, their families broken in the name of divine authority? To understand how 600 names filled those ledgers, how children became inventory, we must turn back the clock. 4 years earlier, a young man stood on the threshold of absolute power. His uncle, the old emperor, lay dying, and with his last breath, Rome's fate shifted into the hands of a single 24-year-old. In the year 37 CE, Emperor Tiberius breathed his last. His nephew, Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, remembered forever by his nickname, Caligula, stepped into the role of absolute ruler. Rome celebrated. After decades of suspicion and cruelty under Tiberius, citizens rejoiced. Senators whispered prayers of relief. Soldiers cheered. The heir of the beloved General Germanicus now wore the purple. Caligula seemed destined for greatness. Raised among legions who adored him, charming enough to melt the forum with his smile, his first acts glowed with generosity. He gave soldiers bonuses, cut taxes, staged grand games in the arena. Senators toasted his name. The people believed their nightmare had ended. But shadows were already gathering inside the palace. Slaves began to vanish. First a young servant girl, then 2 kitchen hands, their bodies later pulled from the Tiber with marks that made hardened soldiers turn pale. No one dared question. Rome excused it as rumor, as accident. After all, Caligula was young. He would mature. He would learn to rule responsibly. Or so they hoped. That illusion would shatter only 6 months later, when Caligula fell gravely ill. For weeks, Rome prayed, believing their new emperor might die before his reign had truly begun. But when he recovered, something inside him had changed. The boy who had entered power as Rome's darling would rise from his sickbed, convinced of his own divinity. And in the fever-bright fire of his eyes, the empire's descent into madness had already begun. When Caligula rose from his sickbed, Rome cheered. Sacrifices filled the temples. Cattle were slaughtered in thanksgiving. Priests declared the gods had spared their emperor. Yet behind the celebrations, whispers spread. Something in him was different. The historian Suetonius would later write that the illness had burned away his humanity. Whatever humanity had remained before, it was gone now. Caligula no longer saw himself bound by mortal limits. He had stared at death and survived. In his mind, that survival was proof he was divine. At first, the change was subtle. Senators' wives received invitations to private dinners, invitations that could not be refused. Young sons of noble families were summoned to the palace and dressed in silks instead of armor. Some families told themselves it was temporary, that he was experimenting, indulging youth, and would grow into responsibility. Rome wanted to believe, but the foundations of horror were already being laid. The Praetorian Guard, once selected for honor, was quietly reshaped. Caligula dismissed those loyal to Rome and replaced them with men chosen for their cruelty, their willingness to obey without hesitation. At his side, a freedman named Helicon became the emperor's master of pleasures, a man whose very survival depended on fulfilling Caligula's darkest wishes. By the summer of 38 CE, a new kind of record appeared in the Imperial archives. Not ledgers for grain shipments or tax collections, but for people, human acquisitions. The entries began sporadically, a merchant's daughter here, a senator's wife there. But soon, names disappeared and were replaced by numbers. To Caligula, strangers were not enough. True power, he believed, was not in taking from the powerless, but in destroying those who thought themselves untouchable. A senator who opposed him, a general who questioned his strategies, a magistrate who ruled against him. Their punishment was not death. Death was mercy. Instead, Caligula seized what they loved most, and forced them to watch as everything they treasured was defiled. The palace itself was reshaped into an engine of terror. Architects were ordered to design new chambers with perfect acoustics, so that the cries within carried clearly to those waiting outside. Torch holders were fixed at precise heights, ensuring fathers forced into service could see everything. Witnesses were mandatory. Records were mandatory. Evil was wrapped in procedure, justified as divine justice. By the beginning of 39 CE, what had begun as private indulgence had hardened into policy. The young emperor who had once charmed the city now commanded a system designed for one purpose: the systematic destruction of human dignity. And no one was beyond reach, not even those closest to him. The night came when Caligula, reclining at a banquet in front of 300 senators, reached out to his sister Drusilla. In full view of Rome's most powerful men, he crossed every boundary of decency and blood. The room froze in silence, the oil lamps crackling louder than the breath of anyone present. Drusilla sat still, her face an empty mask. Beside her, their sisters Julia Livilla and Agrippina stared into their cups of wine, knowing their turn would come. "My divine sisters," Caligula declared, his voice breaking the silence, "blessed by Jupiter himself to share my affection, as Juno shares his." The comparison was unmistakable. Jupiter, king of the gods, had taken his own sister as his wife. By invoking myth, Caligula transformed his outrage into ritual, and the senators faced a choice: applaud the blasphemy or commit treason. They applauded. But what the Senate had witnessed that night was only the beginning, for in the months to come, the emperor would make his sisters into symbols of his dominion, and their humiliation would become Rome's public spectacle. The night of the banquet was only the curtain-raiser. What followed revealed not simply Caligula's corruption, but his obsession with turning family into theatre and shame into policy. It began with Drusilla. During Caligula's illness months earlier, she had been the only one allowed to tend him. When he recovered, their relationship no longer resembled that of brother and sister. Slaves whispered. Guards looked away. Caligula declared publicly that she shared his divinity, and he installed her in the quarters normally reserved for an emperor's wife. Her actual husband, Lucius Cassius Longinus, was quietly dispatched to govern a distant province, a kindness compared to the fate of later husbands. Morning audiences saw Drusilla seated beside Caligula as senators brought petitions, forced to treat her like a queen. Afternoon religious rites cast her and her sisters as priestesses in ceremonies that twisted Rome's sacred traditions. At night, Banquets blurred into performances where humiliation was staged for the empire's most powerful men. Julia Livilla resisted at first. She attempted sarcasm, then open defiance, but her spirit was crushed after a series of very public punishments. Agrippina, the cleverest of the three, chose survival by patience. She bowed her head, smiled when ordered, but stored every humiliation, plotting revenge for a future she could not yet reach. Caligula had a purpose beyond gratification. By forcing senators, generals, and magistrates to witness the degradation of his own blood, he sent a message: "If I can do this to my sisters, imagine what I can do to your daughters." Silence made every man complicit. Applause made every man guilty. Palace scribes documented everything: dates, times, names, rituals. The ledgers read like instruction manuals for atrocity. Human trauma reduced to tidy lines of ink. Then came the pregnancy. When Drusilla's condition became obvious, Caligula proclaimed it a miracle. "She carries a god," he announced. "Our child will rule heaven and earth." Senators dutifully voted honors for the unborn. Priests sacrificed animals to ensure its health. Everyone played their role in the charade. But Drusilla did not live to deliver the child. In June of 38 CE she died. Whether from complications of pregnancy or by poison, no one could say. Caligula's grief was wild and theatrical. He declared her a goddess, demanded temples be built in her name, and ordered all Romans to swear oaths by her divinity. Her sisters, however, received no relief. Instead, their torment deepened. Now they were ordered to impersonate Drusilla during ceremonies, wearing her clothes, speaking in her voice, pretending their dead sister lived on through their suffering. It was not only physical violation but psychological torture, designed to strip them of identity and force them into vessels of the divine lie. Meanwhile, the imperial bureaucracy worked with chilling efficiency. In the palace archives, ledgers listed women as property. Each entry included name, age, family ties, physical details, even notes on usefulness. One scribe's quill transformed noble daughters into inventory, marked for divine service or processing. By the year 39 CE, more than 300 women and 300 boys had been catalogued in these records. The exact numbers were no accident. Quotas were being met. Caligula had industrialized human degradation, turning families into resources, children into commodities, and pain into revenue. Rome was no longer watching a tyrant's excess. It was living inside a system. And as the ledgers grew, so too did the emperor's ambition. Soon, exploitation would not only be about punishment or spectacle. It would become business, carefully managed, highly profitable business. The true horror of Caligula's reign was not simply his cruelty, but his genius for systematizing it. Where earlier tyrants indulged impulses, he built an infrastructure. He turned personal depravity into state policy. In the palace archives, a new set of ledgers expanded each month. They resembled the records of a merchant house more than an empire, yet instead of grain, they catalogued people. Each entry listed age, origin, family ties, and classification. Victims were divided into categories as if they were tools in a workshop. Restricted assignment meant the emperor's personal attention. Standard assignment marked general palace service. Utility assignment was the cruelest designation, reserved for older or less useful victims who would be driven into hard labor until they collapsed. Sabinus, the imperial accountant, oversaw it all. His handwriting survives in fragments discovered centuries later. To him, humans were numbers. Acquisition: 12 senatorial daughters, 8 equestrian wives. Processing complete. His marginal notes revealed the cold calculations of profit, higher revenue from younger categories, focus on new acquisitions. By 39 CE, more than 300 women and 300 boys were recorded in these books. 600 souls reduced to balance sheets. The reports tracked not only who was seized, but also how much revenue they generated. First quarter, 2,000 denarii. Second quarter, 8,000. Third quarter, 15,000. The numbers climbed relentlessly, reflecting a machine running at peak efficiency. Political defiance became directly tied to these ledgers. A senator voted against imperial policy. Within days, his daughter's name appeared in the records. A merchant questioned new taxes. His wife was seized. A magistrate gave the wrong ruling. His entire household was added to the inventory. Helicon, the freedman appointed master of pleasures, ran the procurement network like a general commanding an army. Informants reported on potential targets. Scouts gathered details. Strike teams carried out seizures. Every step was logged. Nothing was left to chance. And once victims were taken, they entered processing. This was no chaotic cruelty, but a structured indoctrination system. For 7 days, they were isolated, starved, and forced to watch others submit. Repetition broke them faster than whips. By the end of a week, most had surrendered, their resistance smothered under exhaustion and fear. Those who survived orientation were assessed like livestock. Scribes noted physical features, health, education, even talents. A woman skilled in languages might be made a translator. One good with numbers might be pushed into accounting. Others, especially the young and the beautiful, were placed in categories whose names disguised their true purpose. For each victim, 2 records were kept, one for immediate use, the other for the permanent archives, ensuring no one could ever vanish into anonymity. Even if they died, their names remained inked on the parchment, their suffering immortalized in bureaucratic detail. It was efficiency masquerading as civilization. Caligula himself reviewed the monthly reports with the same attention a general gave battlefield updates. He demanded higher quotas, faster processing, greater revenue. To him, human life was a resource to be maximized, optimized, and exploited. By the end of that year, the system was running so smoothly that the palace was no longer merely a place of power. It had become a factory of human misery, its ledgers humming with profits, its corridors echoing with screams, its torches burning steady. And the emperor had only begun to expand the machinery. Soon, he would turn one wing of his palace into a temple, a place where exploitation was cloaked in the trappings of religion, and where Rome's noblest women would serve under the title of divine service. The east wing of the palace once held banquet halls and reception chambers. Under Caligula, it became something else entirely. A marble inscription announced it as the Temple of Divine Service. But inside, nothing resembled worship. It was an institution of humiliation, dressed in the trappings of religion. 40 women of senatorial rank were kept there at any given time. Their rotation was managed with military precision. Those who scored highest in evaluations, those judged to be the most beautiful or the most spirited, were often assigned here. The emperor preferred resistance, for breaking it gave him greater satisfaction. The entrance dazzled visitors with marble statues of goddesses whose faces had been recarved to resemble the women forced to serve. Incense burned constantly, masking the stench of exhaustion and fear. A eunuch at the reception desk greeted visitors with rehearsed words. "Welcome to the goddess's service. Your offering has been prepared. May your worship please the divine emperor." Appointments were scheduled like a Senate session. On one day, a senator seeking protection for his grain contracts. The next, a merchant negotiating a tax relief. The following week, a general hoping to secure his son's commission. The system forced Rome's elite to participate. To refuse was to lose everything. To comply was to become complicit. Inside the chambers, luxury met degradation. Silk cushions and golden lamps could not disguise the reality of what took place. Women were prepared by slaves who styled their hair, painted their faces, and dressed them in costumes mocking their dignity. One survivor, Julia Marcella, carved her testimony into the wall of her cell. 4th week of service. 12 appointments daily. I recite poetry to survive. Cornelia died yesterday from exhaustion. They made us watch her burial. The pricing structure revealed how far Caligula had turned horror into commerce. Premium appointments cost more than a soldier's annual salary. Standard sessions had fixed rates. Volume discounts encouraged repeated visits. Special packages combined different experiences, maximizing both humiliation and profit. But the most sinister element was documentation. Every client was required to sign records of their appointments. Copies were preserved in duplicate, stored in the archives. These papers created permanent blackmail. Any senator who might one day oppose the emperor could be destroyed by the proof of his participation. Reports from the temple archives are chilling in their banality. Worker performed adequately but lacked enthusiasm. Recommend corrective measures. Or subject displayed excessive emotion. Suggest additional training. Or even young worker exceeded expectations. Tears added authenticity to divine ritual. Revenue flowed endlessly. Monthly earnings exceeded 50,000 denarii, more than some provinces paid in tribute. Caligula personally reviewed the numbers, demanding longer hours, higher quotas, greater efficiency. His cruelty was not chaos, it was administration. The emperor even forced respected senators to serve as administrators of the temple. One, Gaius Piso, was appointed divine overseer. His role was to schedule appointments, manage punishments, and ensure revenue targets were met. His own wife served in Chamber 3. His private journal, uncovered centuries later, reveals his torment. Day 47. I assigned my friend's wife to a visiting ambassador. She begged me to remember our children once played together. I had no choice. Day 92. Revenues exceed expectations. The emperor is pleased. I vomit blood nightly. Day 130. They brought my daughter. Said she was old enough for divine service. I scheduled her myself. If I refused, she would be given to the guards. Doctors were tasked with keeping women alive, documenting injuries and pregnancies with clinical detachment. Abortions were performed to maintain availability. Those who attempted suicide were force-fed, bound, and returned to service. Even children born from the temple's horrors were taken immediately. Boys were marked for palace service. Girls were raised for future assignments. The system ensured that exploitation became generational. Once a month, Caligula himself attended ceremonies in the temple. Before senators and their families, he forced all 40 women to demonstrate their divine service. He offered commentary, compared techniques, awarded prizes for the most degrading performances. It was no longer private cruelty. It was theater, and if the temple proved anything, it was that Rome itself had become complicit. Husbands, fathers, generals, priests, all participated, whether by silence, applause, or direct involvement. Resistance meant destruction. Compliance meant survival. But Caligula was not finished. The temple was only one piece of his machinery. Soon, he would devise an innovation even crueler, a ritual where fathers themselves were forced to hold the light for their daughters' destruction. If the temple corrupted Rome's families with silence, the torch ritual destroyed them with sight. It began with a summons delivered at dawn. Your presence is required for illumination duty. Bring your eldest unmarried daughter. Compliance ensures your family's continued prosperity. The words were cold, the meaning unmistakable. Refusal meant ruin. Brothers executed. Wives enslaved. Younger children scattered among soldiers. There was no choice. On the appointed night, fathers were led into a long corridor outside Caligula's private chambers. Iron sconces lined the walls at exact intervals, their placements calculated with architectural precision. But the torches were not for decoration. They were meant to be held by fathers, whose trembling flames would light the emperor's chosen rituals. Senator Flavius was one of them. His hands had signed treaties, commanded armies. That night, they clutched a torch that illuminated the doorway behind which his daughter screamed. Ahead of him, Senator Brutus stood rigid, his knuckles white against the bronze handle. Behind him, 4 more fathers waited their turn. Each knew what awaited. Each knew that their silence was the price of their children's survival. Guards explained the rules with casual boredom. 8 feet from the chamber door. Torch held at shoulder height. No lowering. No extinguishing. No closing of the eyes. One even joked that failure meant the next month's inventory would include the senator's younger children. The cruelty was sharpened by design. Windows cut into the chamber doors ensured the fathers could see everything. They were not allowed to turn away. They were not allowed to pretend ignorance. They were forced to illuminate their daughter's humiliation with their own hands, becoming unwilling accomplices in the crime. Inside the preparation rooms, girls were dressed and drugged. The sedatives dulled their strength but preserved their awareness. Caligula preferred victims who understood what was happening. Physicians recorded each detail clinically. Age confirmed, health assessed, cosmetics applied, garments arranged. Forms filled in triplicate. Even horror required paperwork. When one chamber emptied, another father stepped forward. A daughter stumbled out, carried by guards if she could not walk. Then the next child was brought in, and the next torchbearer took his place. The screams and sobs carried perfectly, the acoustics designed for that purpose. Thunderstorms outside could not drown the sounds. Some fathers were given grotesque offers. Hold the torch tonight, and we'll spare your younger daughters. Others were told, 2 hours outside, or 1 hour inside with her. The choices broke men as surely as whips. Graffiti later discovered on the marble walls revealed the aftermath. One father, Quintus Maximus, scratched the words, "We are the damned who breathe, the dead who walk, the fallen who failed their sacred duty. May the gods forgive what emperors compel." The psychological damage was permanent. Many daughters never again looked into their father's eyes, not because they blamed them, but because the shared memory was unbearable. Fathers withdrew into silence, their lives hollowed. Some drank themselves to death. Some fell on their swords. Most simply endured, living as empty vessels, broken by the weight of what they had witnessed. But the true genius of the torch system lay in its wider purpose. It poisoned every family in Rome. Every senator knew it could be his turn next. Every father saw his daughters differently, not as children but as potential offerings. Every household lived with the shadow of summons. The ritual ended with chilling bureaucracy. A guard would collect the torches, mark a receipt confirming duty completed, and hand the father a note guaranteeing his family's temporary safety. The walk home was silent. Fathers and daughters traveled separately, their bond severed forever. And when morning came, senators returned to the forum, sitting side by side, eyes hollow, pretending normal life continued. But each carried the knowledge that love itself had been weaponized against them. Caligula's innovation had succeeded. Not only had he broken individuals, he had broken the very concept of family. Rome itself was unraveling. Yet even this was not his final cruelty. The dinner banquets, where families gathered in gilded halls, carried a new form of torment. There, humiliation became entertainment, and survival depended on applause. If the torch ritual shattered fathers in silence, the imperial banquets broke entire families in public. 50 senators reclined on couches, servants poured wine, musicians plucked at strings. It looked like any other Roman feast. But the palace acoustics told another story. Behind gilded doors, wives were summoned one by one into private chambers with the emperor, and every sound carried into the hall. The music, the laughter, the polite chatter could not conceal the screams. Caligula thrived on this theatre. He would return to the dining couch, adjusting his toga with deliberate ease, then sip from his goblet before addressing the assembly as if nothing unusual had occurred. "Adequate," he might announce casually, "but she lacks proper enthusiasm. Brutus, you really ought to improve the training in your household." Brutus, seated among his peers, forced a smile. He had no choice. His 12-year-old son was under guard. A wrong expression, a misplaced word, and the boy would be next month's offering. So Brutus smiled, nodded, and raised his cup in toast, while the sound of his wife's ordeal still echoed behind him. The emperor turned these dinners into a grotesque game. Husbands were ordered to describe their wives' talents, as though comparing recipes. "Tell us your methods, Brutus," Caligula pressed. "Surely 20 years of marriage have taught you something. Share your wisdom, unless, of course, you would prefer your wife demonstrate for the guards instead." The hall froze. Brutus stammered through forced modesty while his peers studied their plates, desperate not to be noticed. But Caligula's cruelty was never satisfied with silence. He would call on other guests, demanding critique. "Cassius, you've encountered Brutus's wife at the divine temple. How does tonight compare?" "Caught between truth and survival," Cassius answered carefully. "Tonight she seemed more responsive, divine one. Perhaps your touch awakens what mortal men cannot." The emperor beamed. "Precisely. I am teaching them their true nature. They should thank me." Some nights, he summoned multiple wives at once, forcing their husbands to vote on performances as though they were judges at games. At other times, he declared themes: all mothers of 3, all red-haired women, all brides married less than a year. The men ranked their peers' wives, knowing their own spouses would soon face the same. The cruelty was not in the act alone, but in the performance of normalcy. The feast continued as though nothing unusual was happening. Senators debated grain prices while their wives screamed in the next chamber. A young guest once wrote, "I bit through my tongue to keep from weeping." Marcus beside me discussed trade while his wife cried out. He smiled. We all smiled. What else could we do? And then came the gratitude speeches. At the end of each feast, husbands were forced to thank the emperor publicly for honoring their wives. Traumatized women, dragged back into the hall, were ordered to thank him as well. The words caught in their throats, but they spoke them anyway, because survival depended on it. Every detail was recorded: guest lists, assignments, rankings, reactions, copies filed into the archives, ensuring that no one could ever deny their complicity. Even silence was documented. Even compliance was preserved as evidence. Some men snapped. Senator Aurelius began laughing hysterically as his wife's ordeal unfolded. He could not stop, even when guards dragged him away. He spent the rest of his days locked in an asylum, muttering to shadows. Others drank themselves insensible at the table, though drunkenness risked accusations of disrespect. The feasts ended only when Caligula declared himself satisfied. He would lean back, smiling, as husbands and wives, broken, humiliated, terrified, stumbled out into the night. Rome's nobility returned to their villas, pretending life was unchanged, but the damage spread like rot. And still, this was not the worst of it. Caligula's ambition stretched further. He wanted not only to exploit Rome's families, but to manufacture new generations of victims. That ambition gave birth to his darkest experiment, the breeding programs. If the banquets showcased degradation, the breeding programs industrialized it. The idea came to Caligula in late 39 CE. Why limit himself to seizing victims, he reasoned, when he could create future supplies? If women could produce children, then the empire itself could manufacture its own inventory. It was perverse logic cloaked in administrative language, and the palace physicians were ordered to make it reality. Dr. Lucius Scriptor, once trained at Alexandria to heal the sick, now oversaw examinations that treated women like livestock. In a chamber beneath the palace, victims were lined on tables while physicians measured hips, documented menstrual cycles, and noted breeding potential. His notes survive in fragments, their clinical tone more chilling than screams. Subject 142. 19 years old. Excellent fertility. Recommend immediate pairing with robust stock. Multiple offspring possible before decline. Pairings were not marriages. They were assignments. Women were informed of their designated partners only hours before they were pushed into breeding chambers, where guards and physicians observed. Each encounter was recorded, down to the timing, diet, and likelihood of conception. If pregnancy followed, the victim's movements were restricted, her meals controlled, her body monitored like a state-owned asset. One woman, Maria Claudia, left behind a hidden journal discovered centuries later, scratched into plaster cracks. Third assignment today. A soldier who speaks no Latin. We avoid eye contact. The physicians argue about timing, while the guards watch to ensure procedure. I recite my mother's verses to escape. I am nowhere. I am elsewhere. Children born of these programs never knew their mothers. Infants were taken at weaning and assigned numbers instead of names. Boys judged strong were sent into military training by age 5. Those with delicate features were prepared for palace service. Girls considered attractive entered preparatory programs for future exploitation. Others were marked for utility labor. Mortality was high. Nearly half of the infants died before their 5th year. Those who lived were tracked across generations. Successful pairings were repeated. Failed combinations discontinued. The language of livestock farming had been applied to human beings. When women resisted, physicians administered herbs and concoctions that dulled their will or increased fertility. Starvation as a form of rebellion was answered with force feeding. Miscarriages brought punishment. Even death in childbirth was logged clinically. Subject 156 expired. Infant viable. Acceptable loss ratio. Caligula's curiosity warped into grotesque experimentation. Could a senator's daughter paired with a gladiator produce a stronger warrior? Would mixing Roman and Egyptian blood create beauty of exotic value? Each theory was tested. Each child entered into ledgers. The empire's most sacred institution, family, had been reduced to a laboratory experiment. The breeding facilities expanded steadily. New examination rooms, larger holding cells, nurseries for infants awaiting classification. Every addition reinforced the illusion of order, as if atrocity became legitimate when hidden behind procedure. Learned physicians, men who once swore to heal, now discussed optimal breeding windows as casually as they once prescribed medicine. And for the boys too young to breed, another fate awaited. Not death, but transformation. Rome's noble sons, taken at 12 or 13, were stripped of identity, forced into silks and cosmetics, remade as living ornaments for the emperor's halls. The empire was not only manufacturing victims, it was manufacturing identities, shattering childhood, and reshaping Rome's future into something unrecognizable. And within this machinery, one senator would soon learn the price of speaking too boldly against it. Marcus Claudius, who had already watched too much, was about to be summoned for his final lesson. The breeding programs reduced women to vessels, but boys suffered an equally grotesque fate. They were not killed, nor trained as soldiers. Instead, they were transformed. The northern wing of the palace became what witnesses later called the transformation chambers. Mirrors lined the walls, so boys were forced to watch themselves change. Tailors cut away their tunics and burned them, a symbolic funeral for their former selves. Perfumed baths stripped away the scent of childhood. Silk robes replaced Roman togas. The victims were sons of Rome's elite, aged between 10 and 15. Many had been preparing for military training or rhetorical study when guards dragged them from their homes. Now they were taught to walk with feminine grace, to pitch their voices higher, to serve wine with lowered eyes. Marcus Quintus was 12 when taken. Only that morning he had been practicing speeches under his tutor. By nightfall, cosmetics had been painted onto his face, flowers woven into his hair, and he was renamed Flora. His father's criticism of grain policy had sealed his fate. The training was relentless. Boys who failed to master the required softness of movement were beaten. Those who refused to wear their assigned garments were starved until they complied. Dancing lessons lasted hours. Servants drilled them in cosmetics, posture, and performance. Childhood was ground out under layers of powder and silk. A survivor named Gaius Maximus, once the son of a general, left a desperate message scratched into a dormitory wall. Day 23. They made me dance for my father's enemies while wearing my mother's jewelry. Tomorrow I serve wine at the feast. I pray for poison in my cup. Once trained, the boys were presented like merchandise. They stood on platforms while senators, merchants, or visiting dignitaries inspected them. Notes were taken. Lot 17. Formerly Marcus Quintus. Now Flora. Age 12. Skilled in dance. Excellent condition. Minimum selection fee. 1,000 denarii. The language stripped away all traces of humanity. Some boys survived by creating alternate personalities, dividing themselves so one part endured while the other hid deep inside. Others clung to the relative safety of being chosen by a single patron rather than shared among many. A few, considered beautiful beyond measure, lived longer than most, but at the cost of being claimed constantly. Physicians added another layer of humiliation. They examined the boys regularly, documenting their growth, ensuring they remained suitable for service. Records noted voice changes, body development, and even suggestions for how long each child could maintain their assigned role before aging out. And what happened when they aged? At 16, most were deemed too old for illusion. Some were mutilated, turned into eunuchs for permanent palace service. Others were reassigned to soldiers' barracks, condemned to a different form of torment. A handful were bought back by families for staggering sums, returned home as shadows of who they once were. The cruelty did not stop at the body. It reached into the soul. Every boy was stripped of his birth name, given titles like Flora, Livia, or Lily, feminine names that erased their Roman identities. With each passing month, some forgot what they had once been called. One senator described seeing his son in the palace, carrying wine in translucent silk. I did not recognize him until his hand trembled. He trembled the same way during his lessons when afraid of failure. That was when I knew. My warrior son was gone. Only the painted ornament remained. I left the hall to vomit. The transformation of sons poisoned fathers as deeply as the torch ritual did with daughters. Rome's future leaders had been recast as symbols of submission, their suffering a warning to all. And for Senator Marcus Claudius, who had already endured the unendurable, the final blow was near. His outspoken defiance in the Senate had not gone unnoticed. Caligula was preparing a personal demonstration, one that would fuse every cruelty into a single night of thunder, lightning, and betrayal. The storm that broke over Rome, the night of Senator Marcus Claudius's summons, seemed to mirror what awaited within the palace. Lightning cracked against the marble walls, thunder rolled across the city, and still the summons read the same. Your presence required for illumination duty. Bring your eldest unmarried daughter. Immediate compliance mandatory. Marcus had spoken too boldly in the Senate that day, denouncing a new prostitution tax as an affront to Roman dignity. His words had marked him for punishment. Now he walked through the palace gates with his 14-year-old daughter Claudia, her hand trembling in his own. She believed they were attending a ceremony. He knew better. At the checkpoint, guards separated them. Claudia was led toward preparation chambers, where attendants stripped her, painted her face, and drugged her lightly to dull resistance. Marcus was handed a torch. "Standard position," the guard muttered. 8 feet from the Emperor's door. Shoulder height. Don't lower it. Don't look away. Your son's safety depends on it. The corridor stretched before him like a grave. Other fathers stood already in place, each holding fire, each hollow-eyed. Windows cut into the chamber doors revealed everything within. No father could pretend ignorance. No daughter could pretend she had been spared her father's gaze. When Claudia was brought past, Marcus tried to speak, but his throat closed. Her eyes found his. Confusion, fear, desperate hope. He could only hold the flame as guards led her inside. Then the doors closed, and the sounds began. The thunder outside could not drown her cries. The lightning outside only sharpened the shadows within. Marcus gripped the torch until his arm burned, whispering poetry under his breath, counting heartbeats to keep his mind from shattering. But nothing could silence the moment when his daughter's voice rose above the storm, calling for him. He could not move. He could not save her. He could only stand, the unwilling lantern of her undoing. Hours later, she was carried out alive but transformed. She no longer looked at him. She would never look at him the same way again. The scribes marked the entry in their ledger with brutal indifference. Item 247. Claudia Claudius. Age 14. Acquisition reason. Paternal opposition. Processing complete. Revenue potential high. Marcus returned home a broken man. In the Senate, he voted as directed, his voice gone. At home, silence filled the air between father and daughter. Love remained, but it had been weaponized, shattered, turned into an unbearable memory. This was Caligula's true genius, not merely in seizing bodies, but in severing bonds. Fathers could no longer protect their daughters. Sons no longer knew their names. Wives and husbands could no longer look each other in the eye. The family itself, Rome's foundation, had been dismantled by design. But tyranny breeds enemies. On January 24, 41 CE, the Praetorian Guard turned on Caligula, not for morality, not for justice, but because his madness threatened their own power. They cornered him in a corridor, and the man who had demanded others' screams now begged for his life. Their blades silenced him swiftly, yet his death did not erase the ledgers. The torches remained fixed to palace walls. The records endured, cold and clinical, each line a scar etched in ink. Archaeologists centuries later would uncover fragments, names reduced to numbers, infants reduced to entries, fathers reduced to witnesses. And the trauma outlived the emperor. Daughters who had survived became mothers who flinched at thunder. Sons who had been renamed grew into men who could not remember their birth identities. Fathers who had once carried torches raised children in silence, their love twisted by the memory of betrayal. Caligula's reign proved a chilling truth. Depravity becomes most dangerous not when it erupts in chaos, but when it is systematized, documented, and disguised as policy. His cruelty was not impulse. It was infrastructure. The ruins of his palace still whisper of that night. Empty sconces line the marble halls, torch holders that once forced fathers to illuminate their children's suffering. Visitors speak of unease during storms, when thunder rattles the stones as it did 2,000 years ago. Perhaps it is imagination. Perhaps it is memory. Or perhaps some flames never truly go out. Because in the end, Caligula's legacy was not just in Rome's history. It is in the warning he left behind, that when power dresses cruelty in procedure, when bureaucracy masks horror in ledgers, even love itself can be broken, and entire civilizations can collapse without a single wall falling. The thunder fades. The ruins remain. The lesson endures.